Okay, hello everyone. Welcome to the final part of the 2024 PNCA Symposium Trans Geographies. And so we have a round table for you today with the four of us who are up here, three of whom have already spoken. And so this discussion is called Future Directions in Trans Research and Activism, featuring Molly Vaughan, Robin Merrill, Sa Whitley, and me, Sloan McNulty. So I'm going to have each one of the panelists kind of do whatever introduction that they feel like for this, since you all have heard their extended bios. Again, my name is Sloan McNulty. I teach here in liberal arts and critical studies, and this work is very close to my heart. And so I'm very much looking forward to engaging with these panelists up here, and we'll spend probably about an hour talking, and then maybe open it up to questions towards the end. So I'll just start with Sa.
Hi, everyone. Great to see a lot of you again who were here yesterday for our Trans Geography Symposium. Thanks for coming back. My name's Dr. Sa Whitley. I use they, them pronouns. I'm a assistant professor at Arizona State University. I teach in the School of Social Transformation there, which within it has a Women and Gender Studies unit. I'm also the co-director of the Queer X initiative at the ASU Humanities Institute. We have a really cool Black Trans Futurities Symposium coming up in March. Check it out online. And yeah, I have a PhD in Gender Studies, an MA in African American Studies from UCLA. I've had some other positions since that graduate work at the Pembroke Center for Teaching and Research on Women at Brown, the Society of Fellows at Dartmouth. I'm also a poet. You can find some recent poems in Poetry Magazine, Palette Poetry, some coming up in Indiana Review and Black Warrior Review. And so I am sort of on stage as artist, but in the literary arts. But so happy to be here. And I'm excited for this conversation.
Hi there. I'm Robin Merrill. You've heard my voice a lot, so I will keep it short. I'm a law professor at Williamette in Salem, where I teach constitutional law and admin. I'm originally from Oklahoma, which is a huge part of my experience, so I talk about it a lot. And I am a proud graduate of the University of Oklahoma and Temple University in Philadelphia, where I went to law school. Before I started teaching, I worked at the Human Rights Campaign and started my career at the Department of Housing and Urban Development right out of law school. I think that's all you need to hear my voice right now. But thank you for being here. I see, I'm still talking, I'm sorry. But what I was gonna say was how grateful I am to be here and to be in such a nice space with people after a really hard week. So thank you.
I also want to thank everyone for being here and thank the rest of the panel for being here. I'm Molly Vaughan. I'm a full professor at Bellevue College, which is in Bellevue, Washington. I teach drawing and painting and printmaking. I have an MFA from the University of South Florida, where I studied printmaking and worked at Graphic Studio, which is a sculpture and printmaking atelier, and a BFA from School of Visual Arts, which is in New York, but 3 of those years was in Savannah before my college was shut down by the Savannah College of Art and Design. And we were then all sent to New York for our last year, so I did not really get the New York experience. So don't ask me about living in New York. My work deals with, my work is here, of course. I hope you've had a chance to see it. And my work deals with issues of transness. A friend of mine introduced me once at a talk as a multimodal artist, and I just like that. I have no idea what it means, but I feel like it describes me pretty well. And yeah, I'm here with very brilliant people that I'm really excited to talk to. And yeah, thanks for having me.
Perfect. So I think the way that this is going to work is I have a number of questions that I've come up with, but also I invite any of the panelists to ask or continue conversations, and we'll see where they meander to. So again, I'm Sloan McNulty. I realized I didn't really actually introduce myself. I do teach here again in liberal arts and critical studies. I have a PhD in American Studies from Rutgers University, and much of my specialization is in and around questions of gender and political economy in particular. So I'm very excited to have this conversation with such a variegated group of folks to just think through their various disciplinary interests. And I'm sorry, the first question I'm going to start off with is a hard question. So it's kind of about the elephant in the room, in that we had an election recently, and the outcome of that was not great, right, to say the least. And so I'm thinking about, as a panel that's on questions of activism and future directions, right, how each of you are thinking about what this new atmosphere, in a way that continues a lot of the old atmospheres, right, is impacting your thinking about pathways to not only trans survival, right, but to trans liberation, is my kind of opening question.
I don't know, like, I'm just gonna go. I think one of the things to really understand is that a Harris-Walz campaign wasn't really going to change a ton for trans people, right? That, like, we were already suffering a lot of discrimination, this huge wave of anti-trans legislation and anti-queer legislation as well, but focusing primarily on trans people. And that was going to continue. I mean, Biden, I said this at my talk, Biden was the most visibly pro-trans president we've ever had. And still, 1,263 bills were written in the past 2 years against trans people and queer people. So that wasn't ever going to stop. That was not going to end, you know. And the biggest thing that I have already seen, because primarily I've been going to anti-trans states to work, it was kind of nice to come here, is self-censorship. Because the laws at higher education institutions in particular, the way that these laws are written are very smart in that they are vague. And so it's very hard for institutions and teachers to really know, and curators to really know when they're stepping over a boundary. And that's very purposeful. And so, you know, I've had lectures canceled recently. I've lost exhibitions, you know, and the primary thing that I've, you know, really found is when I do have a situation where, like, I lose an exhibition, I sort of say to, like, the curator at the institution, well, who do you know that might actually show my work? And so that was how I ended up showing at the Alabama Center for Contemporary Art. And one of my talks coming up in Florida is at a gallery that I know very well, but it wasn't planned to be at the gallery, but that's where the talk was moved to. And so relying, as always, on community and spaces which are, you know, not even being offered state funds for survival. And one of the things, I'm not going to talk forever because I feel like I talked a lot about this in my talk yesterday, but one of the things that I've noticed is, and we saw it with the Harris campaign too, which is this attempt to be centralist. It is not going to work. It is a fallacy. You cannot throw people under the bus and expect people to vote for you. So like institutions that I know of, I'm trying to be very careful, previously very vocal institutions for social justice are now saying, well, we need to make sure that there's space for both sides to be heard, and everyone needs to feel comfortable, and nobody needs to feel uncomfortable, and everybody should be good, and like, let's not push any boundaries, let's just go under the radar. And that is a losing cause. So we have to fight that sort of centralist ideal and try to stand up against some of these big Supreme Court decisions that have really left us in these messes, like Citizens United. I mean, Citizens United did so much damage to us. And we can all say from a neoliberals, like neoliberal corporations, like they also get a say now with their dollars, right? And Starbucks can provide gender affirming care, and, they also get to lobby legislators, but they shouldn't have been able to, just like, whoever, the Ford Foundation shouldn't be able to. And so these sort of things that don't seem like they're linked to civil rights and social justice are deeply linked to civil rights and social justice. So like looking to overturn Citizens United would be something that we could do that would be tremendously beneficial for us as activists.
I can hop in. I think that something that has oddly given me some resolve is to resituate myself temporally, in this moment, is that we have been in a state of emergency long since before this week, we have been living in a crisis, and I think differently situated as we are, right? For the folks that, appear and are represented in Molly Vaughan's project on this panel, Project 42, the Movement for Black Lives has already stated that there's this epidemic against trans women of color, Black trans women, and that's been ongoing. That's been ongoing and years. And I think that it's maybe odd to say that gives me some resolve, but, and I do feel let down this week. But I also try to remember that I think liberal politics are not really the terms of order that I want to be dealing with primarily. I think there's this both and, that a lot of us in the room are engaged in, going beyond democracy, because one, democracy let us down this week, but it's let us down every week. It's let us down every week since it's been founded on settler colonialism and genocide, anti-Blackness coming out of slavery, the xenophobia that was kind of in the alt-right and Republican campaign, right? The anti-transness. This idea that if we just heal democracy, it will let us in and all of us will be saved and happy, and that's like the horizon for our rights and our self-determination. Liberalism will always exclude people, right? So there might be some trans folks who are like thinking like Caitlyn Jenner, right? That, yeah, okay, liberalism's treating you pretty well, you're doing good. But and at the same time, we do wrestle with the state. And I like to use that word wrestle, because we know that the state is also, in the business of empire as well, So like the idea that a Kamala Harris presidency was going to suddenly make the US not an empire, right? And not also potentially amplify this like US-Israel relationship of sending, sort of military aid and missiles. So to like think about, I don't know, being included in a democracy on that order, that's frightening, right? We don't want to be a part of that. I don't want to be a part of that. At the same time, there's that both and that I talked about where, we want folks to be able to get the healthcare that they want and need, We want trans girls to be able to play sports. I played soccer in college. And, all of these different, I think what is important for me right now is, and especially as an educator, to challenge these very trans antagonistic and Black antagonistic knowledge projects that are at work all around us, and how they connect to others as well. But that's sort of the fight that I'm interested in at this moment.
I think I want to echo what both of you said around this idea that a Harris-Walz administration would not have been a cure-all. And I think that just personally, I think I felt that, that it was obviously the, lesser of two evils, and et cetera, et cetera. And obviously Harris would have done amazing things. But I think that to the extent that we have been in crises for years, if not decades, I think that a Harris administration would have been a relief. It would have been a Band-Aid in a lot of ways. But it wouldn't have fixed the system. It wouldn't have fixed what was broken. And as terrifying as it is to think about 4 more years under Trump, and what is possible now that the Supreme Court has the majority that it has, I also think that what perhaps may have seemed optional as far as, well, we can continue to sort of move our little political pieces around and feel good about what we're doing, and that's progress. We can't do that anymore because they've taken away the institutions. In a way, it forces us to really give into reality that we don't have the institutions and that we need to be working on other things and through other channels. And had Harris won, I don't think that we would do the soul searching and the community organizing and the skills building and sort of the people energizing that we need to do, that we were going to have to do regardless. And so obviously I am disappointed. I was surprised. I was not shocked, but I was surprised. I think that it is also terrifying because it means that more than half of the country thought that Donald Trump was a better pick. I think that's probably one of those, at core, we're not just fighting against an administration, we're fighting against a mentality that elected him, it's really scary. But even if Harris had won, millions and millions and millions and millions of people would have agreed with Trump. And would we have wrestled with that enough if Harris had won? And I don't think we would have, so.
Yeah, and I think these are good points that each of the panelists have kind of gotten to these questions around what are the structural antecedents to this, right? What are the things that have brought us to this moment that have characterized the U.S. political machine since its inception? And so I think part of the impetus for the question for me is that so often these panels can be theoretical exercises, right? Where we come up here and we say like, well, here is an idea of things that like would be nice to do or things that would have been nice to like have happened. And I think one thing that's really grounding for me, right, is thinking about what are practical steps that people who might be in this audience, whether that's over Zoom or in this building right now, can take to ensure that their trans friends, that their trans selves, that their queer and BIPOC friends, families, and other can do in your minds and your particular expertises, right, in this moment. That's something that I think is really galvanizing and like has been generative for me to not wallow in depression or, to actually move forward, right? And that's something that I'm really interested in how you practice that or how you feel like folks could practice that.
I'm gonna add. Sorry, I'm like afraid of like talking when it's on. I have two things I want to say. One is a dream, because we're allowed to dream, and the other one is practical. Okay, my dream is to end the nonprofit status of taxes in America. I think it would do huge, huge, huge things. And that's, sorry, I'm an atheist, but also like I do believe that like the church's role in our politics was never meant to be what it is right now. And a lot of that has to do with money, and a lot of that has to do with power, and a lot of that money comes from them being nonprofit organizations. They are the largest landowners in the world, and they do not pay taxes in many places that they exist. The second thing is we hear a lot, I'm hearing this a lot from my cis women friends, which is, can I get birth control to help trans women? But I never hear anything from cis men who say, do you think it's possible that I could get a prescription for testosterone that, even if it's just one vial of testosterone, could that help the community? And the answer is yes. These laws are, I don't know if this works. These laws are written in such a way, right? Like this is what the Supreme Court case is about, is that like you can't say that you can give puberty blockers to a cis kid and you cannot give them to a trans kid. The science doesn't say that it works on one type of kid and it doesn't work on another kind of kid. And so, we're talking a lot, I'm hearing constantly, and this is because I'm a trans femme, like people reaching out and saying, can I get birth control? Like, what can I do? And I'm like, yes, you can do those things. Find networks that are safe for you to distribute. I didn't say that. But also, there is no reason why cis men cannot get involved. And even if you go to a doctor and they prescribe you testosterone for one because you say like, I'm having whatever sort of thing may happen, I don't know what happens, then they say, okay, but you have to have your numbers checked next month. And you go back and they check your numbers and like, you got too much testosterone for this. You're like, okay, but you still got one vial of testosterone that you could distribute. Because in America, testosterone is a class of class C. Is it class C? Class C restricted drug. But estrogen isn't. So that's a practical thing. And like as a trans woman and as a trans femme, we have been medicalizing our community for a really long time without doctors. And I think that there are lots of resources out there that you can find that you could look into, that but be careful. I'm not a doctor. But it's practical. This is a practical thing that you can do. If you live in Oklahoma, I'm just going to pull that out of the nowhere. If you live in Oklahoma, you can go to a school board meeting. And when someone stands up and says, I saw on Libs of TikTok that children are peeing in cat boxes and then they are, eating monkeys or whatever, you can stand in that school board meeting and say, this is not true, this is false. I've been to school board meetings here, in Washington State, where people have said that queers are equal to Nazis because we want people to use our pronouns. And you can go to those school board meetings and show up. Your biggest power, I believe, is in your local elections, and that's something that you can do for practicality. is vote in your local elections and be aware. Things like school board meetings, school board leaders. You know, I'm a teacher and I believe in that stuff because like when I, you know, people say like, oh, you're indoctrinating children. Yeah, I'm totally indoctrinating children. Yep. Love, community, acceptance, doing it. You know, and like, you know, someone threatened to fire me from one of my professorships in Florida for being trans when I first transitioned in 2012. Right? And now I couldn't teach in Florida probably. And that's the point of that, is to get you out of the classroom so you're not visible and you're not showing people that like you can be a successful person and trans. So I think those are, not to throw, not, you know, you know, the system that we have is the system that we have. And that's one of the things I think about is like how to like infiltrate that system in the places that like do have functionality while that system still exists.
Yeah, I love this question. And I think I love it as someone who has been an organizer, not in the present, and an educator, like in the academy. And I think that one important response to that is thinking about how some trans like legal theorists and lawyers are doing work right now. I don't know if folks follow Erin Reed in the morning. I see some nods, yeah. I love the work, you know, that she is doing and making these connections across the very anti-trans sort of bills and legislation on these these various orders, right? The sports, the, you know, sort of preventing trans youth from getting gender-affirming care. And I think that the work is so important because we need to, I think, really begin strategically sharing the types of contestation and critique that we're developing on the local level, and you know, sort of being in conversation and sharing that with each other, right? Because we're seeing the same discourse, right? And of course, the different states are, you know, sort of, you know, locally and sort of differently situated in some ways. But I think that we need to start doing that, like thinking local to the national, sharing our knowledge, thinking even international in terms of our resistance strategies. I also think that in terms of trans politics, I think one of the cool things that's has been happening really in trans studies is, you know, we're kind of putting trans where people may not think that it belongs as an analytic, as a politics, as a vision, right? So what does that mean? I think, you know, bringing trans politics and theory to maybe movement spaces or community organizing spaces that might be Black specific or have like Black in the title or like migrant in the title, not trans in the title, but like we need to actually think about how we are connecting our movements, right? And showing up even in places where we might not be fully recognized, and vice versa, of course, right? And really kind of tinkering with what solidarity means, what accomplishment means, and it's not actually easy. So I think that the next 4 years, and of course always, it's about how do we build power? It's like really sitting with sometimes the discomfort of trying to show up for each other across movement spaces, across movements, and still trying to connect across that discomfort, you know, as we sort of try to like help each other understand each other and our struggles, and how, you know, transness actually is a part of all of these struggles. Like trans people are in all of these communities. So yeah, that's, I think, something that's relevant to me. And given that we are in an art institution right now, Pacific Northwest College of Art, I think that we can't just be practical, you know? In order to change the sort of ideological landscape, we have to be impractical. You know, we still have to be seeking the impossible, you know? And that's what I think I've seen in a lot of the student art that's on view here today, you know, Molly Vaughn's projects. What is the world that we want to see? We still need to be doing that work as well as the mutual aid and kind of like support and care labor that we're doing. That dreaming, I think, around what otherwise we need has to be done in tandem.
So I want to start with the tangible and looking at, because both of you mentioned school boards and the amazing job that the right has done in franchising hate across the country. They've done a great job, right? There are guidebooks and model language for on the Heritage Society, on the Federalist Society, on Focus on the Family's websites that are really just a go-to, and they've done a great job. And I think that we can learn from that in a lot of ways, because what they have done to politicize school boards is educate and manipulate and give people these tools to engage with their elected leaders. And they've given them tools of hate, and the model that they're selling is this odd self-preservation through exclusion and villainizing. And I think that we can do better, I suppose, is what I want to say. And I think that there is a space for working on the local level or the school board level of equipping people that do want to go speak at a school board with all of the materials that they need to combat these people that are weaponized. Because I think that is what is hard, is that often you might have a well-meaning person who wants to go to the school board, and then they're going to be against people all in matching t-shirts with all of the right messaging, yelling. And that well-meaning person might only do that once. So I think providing the community and the support for people that do want to do good is really important. I think the question is practical things we can do. Okay. So I think educating and communicating and engaging with the community is really important. I had a conversation on my podcast on Friday with Heif Feldblum, who is the former commissioner at the EOC, and she worked on all of the Title VII Bostock cases, and is one of the reasons her work on the EOC is why Title VII includes sexual orientation and gender identity. And I asked her the same question of what do we do? And her answer was, we talk about the rights we still have. We talk about the laws that we still have. We don't let people intimidate us out of what we do still have. And I think that is important, is that if you were living in Oklahoma or Alabama or Tennessee or Florida, your life isn't, you still have some rights still. The fact that Trump was elected on Tuesday, you do still have coverage under the EOC. You do still have this. And so I think sort of beating back the fear, well-earned fear, based on this idea that you do still have something. But I think on a sort of a micro level, providing space and community and conversation is also going to be really important. And I think there's going to be a lot of need to, as we sort of step back from our institutional advocacy, and I agree 100% about the nonprofit business, right? And I think one of the things that we see with sort of this institutionalized mechanism that we have for civil rights advocacy is that you need to somehow be attached to a big organization or a big nonprofit or something in order to make the systemic institutional change. And that is not right. And I think that by sort of stepping back from that nonprofit space, I think it lets us look more at how to make change on the micro level. but I think that a big core of the next 4 years is going to be around self-care and community and building people's power so they can fight. And what that fight looks like, I'm not quite sure yet.
Yeah, and so I think I want to pick up on something that has come up a little bit, which is around this question of the production of knowledge, right? Like, how do we reproduce systems of knowledge with some level of fidelity in the informational like ecosystem that we live in today, right? Seeming to be one of the thinking of your talk, Robin, right, about how fascism emerges. This is one of those spheres where people, either trans activists or people who are just trying to be anti-fascists writ large, right, have a very uphill battle in terms of how they counter this massive machine of right-wing propaganda, right, specifically around trans people. And so for people who work in these, again, diverse arenas, academia, artistic practice, the law, these are vectors for those things, right? And so I'm thinking about, like, how do we share the information that is going to be crucial to building these kinds of political arguments that we've talked about thus far?
So I've thought a lot about this, actually, because in my past life, I worked at the Human Rights Campaign, and a huge part of my job was how to communicate the law or Supreme Court cases or really nerdy sounding regulatory actions happening at these bizarre agencies into a language that not only made sense, but people would care about. And I believe in it so much. I think that it is critical that we give people credit for caring, I think, or the capacity to care and the capacity to be interested and to learn. Because I think, one of the questions earlier was, do you walk away from somebody who's just absolutely disagreeing with your rights? And I think that it is so important to go ahead and name things even when they're scary and unpopular, and to assume that not everyone, but a lot of people will care and will want to do good. And I realize that might sound naive, but I am a naive person. I still really believe in democracy as a possibility, and not as this like perfection thing that we're going to somehow go back in time and make something that was never right. But this idea that it is actually sort of moving towards something. And so I think I just think it's so important to have meaningful conversations and produce meaningful work that is accessible and respectful, and assumes and gives people sort of not the, I guess the benefit of the doubt that they're going to care and they're going to do good things with it. And absolutely, people are going to disappoint you every day of the week. Like, that's going to happen. And it might happen most of the time, but it's not going to happen all the time. And I think you are going to be able to get more people sort of in. So I suppose my big thing is just to create avenues for conversation and space, and I don't know, without fancy things. I don't know. I'm from Oklahoma, and I just think of like, not that we're not fancy. Reba McEntire, anybody? Does anybody? Yes, there it is. Okay. But that there's possibility, and we just need to give people a chance to grasp on. I don't know. Naive. Hashtag.
It's beautiful. It is. I think so. Right? Like we have to have hope. We do. And you know, I was in this amazing exhibition this year at the National Museum for Women in the Arts in DC. And I was in the galleries and I overheard this couple, and they were just telling like the most ridiculously incorrect information to each other about trans care. And they were like, not that I want to like discriminate, you know, kind of thing, like, you know. And eventually I just was like, you know, like I have Gwen here and I have Myra here, and like they're on exhibition, and I need to step in and protect their spirits from this ridiculousness. And I just said, you know, excuse me, I'm overhearing what you're talking about. And then we had like a 10-minute talk, and then they were like, I didn't know any of that, you know, and thanks for talking to us about it. And gosh, does that take a lot. It takes a lot. And, you know, I think it's important to understand that not every single student that comes into my classroom is like, oh, you're trans? Okay. Like, no problem, you know? And so my students, first of all, I worked really hard, and one day will pay off a lot of money for my title of professor, so I make them call me professor. I also think it's an act of, like, it's an act of visibility to be like, trans women can be professors, you know? And also there are students that come into my classrooms who are not comfortable calling me she, her. So we just use professor because it is gender neutral. And I have these conversations with people, like students, you know, I fail them, just joking. But, you know, like I have these conversations where I'm like, you know, this is what it's like. This is who I am. This is what is said about us that's not true. And sometimes I have students be like, you know, I was raised totally different to believe that the only thing that, you know, a person like you would ever be would be a criminal or whatever, you know. And so like it does matter. I do believe in education. But it feels so overwhelming. You know, it feels so overwhelming. And like I always think about how like they spent $80 million on anti-trans ads. What if they like fed the poor with that money? I shouldn't say that. What if they fed people who are suffering from income injustice? That's a better way to say that. I think I was thinking biblically, which I know nothing about. But like, you know, like and the Democrats are just as bad. Like these massive amounts of money, more money than we will ever sort of be in the proximity of. Harris just needs $25 more. It's an emergency. And then the next day it's, you know, Waltz wants you to give $50 because it's 600 times more donation power. And it's like, really? Why doesn't that person with 600 times of that money just give that money to them? You know? And it does beat down, makes you feel like you cannot make an individual change. But you actually can. It just takes a lot. And also, sometimes it's okay to be really, really, really fucking angry. And sometimes it's okay to say, you know what, like, I'll hear you out. I don't remember the question, I'm just babbling. But I mean, that's the reality. Like you said, you believe in democracy. You know, I think that, I mean, you know, the way that this country has a possibility of running, it's there. We just have to completely overhaul every single aspect of what exists, and like that's where the problems arise. You know, I think about the HRC, you know, when they had the marriage equality movement, you know, that I remember hearing once that after marriage equality was won, the donations to HRC dropped to something like a 16% yes response to help fight for trans rights. So they'd gone from 100% yes or whatever to all the people they asked, and then it dropped all the way down to 16%. You know, we have historically powerful and important people to our community as a queer community who were legislators who said things like trans people would get them on the next round. And they have not gotten us. And we've gone from, I don't even know where I'm going now. You know, we've gone from in about 2000, somewhere around 2016, 2018, there was a bipartisan panel in the Senate about studying anti-trans violence to try to put an end to anti-trans violence. It was started with a Republican who had a trans grandchild and a Democrat who had a trans child. Right? That seems impossible now. But yet 33 Republicans signed on to protect gender affirming care in the court case that's coming to the Supreme Court. Like, it does exist. The ideology may be different, but it does exist. And it's like a needle in a haystack. But we do have, I think those things are points of hope. And yeah, did you ask a question? Did I answer anything?
Sort of, yeah. Yeah, so...
It's the estrogen, I'm sorry. There's just so much of it. It's just like boiling through
Classic.
me. Yeah.
So the question was really about like information ecosystems, right? And how we reproduce ideas.
You use too big of a words for me.
Okay.
Yeah.
So how we transmit knowledge in a way that's equitable.
How would what?
How we transmit knowledge.
Oh yeah,
in a way that's...
use encrypted networks.
Yeah.
Okay, thank you.
Perfect.
Sorry.
I think one of the biggest lessons I've learned as, you know, it's like I just transitioned from a postdoc to assistant professor. But, you know, part of my feminist pedagogy is that I don't know everything and that the university is not the only site of knowledge. And sometimes I need to show up and just listen, especially as someone who, you know, I don't identify as trans, identify as non-binary. You know, and so I think in terms of experiential knowledge, that's not, you know, what I have in terms of trans subjectivity or experience. So yeah, sometimes just like a deep listening, you know, thinking about one's privilege is so great. I also think that, you know, we learn a lot from movements. We learn a lot from social movements. One of the ones that I have written about, though not published about yet, is called National Bailout. It's sort of a collective of different organizations, right, that raise money to get Black mamas out of jail, right, pre-trial detention. And they do this campaign, like a sort of Mother's Day campaign, like Black Mamas Bailout is what it's called, right? So basically they're organizing around criminal justice debt to get people who have not been convicted of a crime out of jail, right? So it's like this very radical form of like jail support, debt refusal, and just community care. But I call that a knowledge project because the way that they define mama is not just like, this very like cis hetero notion of mama. On their site they have, and for mama, this means like mothers of the movement, right? Miss Major, this means like trans women, folks that, who are doing the work of radical mothering, who are mothering our movements, mothering our communities, and what that means. That's like a total paradigm shift, right? Like that's creating a paradigm shift around like what motherhood is. And I think that the right, the Republican Party, the alt-right, they're kind of doing something with this discourse of the child, the innocent child, the child that doesn't know what they want, right? And so that's like a particular knowledge, like formation that is ignorant, that's ignorant. And so, but I think that it's rhetorically strategic on their part, right, to center this notion of the innocent child. And so I think I put those together, like the mama, the child. It's like, there's that other movement in Oakland, I think it was called like Moms for Housing, right? These moms, in the afterlife of the subprime mortgage crisis, the foreclosure crisis, they take over this abandoned house. Like, why should we not get to live in this house? There's so many vacant properties in Oakland, and the real estate market is just out of control. And so they're sort of putting forth this idea. A colleague of mine, Savannah Kilner, actually argues in some of her work that they're deserving because housing is a right, not because they can pay for it. Not because they can sort of get a mortgage contract, but because housing is a right. Like that's a radically different idea than like, okay, so like I went to my financial literacy class, I got my credit down. So that's all that to say, a lot of the stuff that we write about as academics and movements we're a part of, some of that knowledge that's like a sort of symbiosis in terms of the ecosystem you're talking about. I also wanted to just mention that this week, folks at my institution, I'm sure here and other institutions, faculty, students are meeting and being like, okay, what does this mean? What does this moment mean for us in academia, right? On the one hand, it's this site can be considered this site of privilege, right? And, what some people might see as armchair academics or activists or what have you. But it's also a site of struggle, There's like labor unions on our campuses and like, unionized workers or workers trying to get organized on our campuses. And so I think the university as like a knowledge sort of like maker, right? The university gets to decide all of these norms, right, around who a student can be as well, and who gets to make knowledge. And so I think a lot of queer movements right now are also centering queer youth, queer and trans youth, and sort of sort of emboldening, stepping back for trans youth to sort of share knowledge as well. I think I'll stop there, but yeah, I love those questions. I'm just like wanting to go all over the place, but yeah.
Yeah, I really appreciate the direction that you took that in, and as you were talking, it was really making me think about your presentation yesterday around questions of how private property in particular is this mechanism of like enclosure, not only for something like housing space, right? Or job opportunity, but also around questions of information, right? So if the mechanisms through which we are able to disseminate information are gatekept by biased institutions, right? Entities like Twitter, right? These horrifying places of right-wing echo chamberness. How do we move past that, right? And the academy is another one of those unfortunate places that has closed off a lot of that information. But to pick up on what you were actually talking about, right? I think a question that's really important to think about in a roundtable that's on activism in the future is to think about children, right? Who have been such an inflection point for attacks on transness. And so I don't necessarily have a formulated question for this, but I would love to hear each of you speak a little bit maybe about like what you feel about that notion in this moment. Like, what can we provide for children who are already beholden to all kinds of discipline, right, from the family to larger institutions? And how do we think about that as a site of trans activism? Yeah.
Can we talk for a moment about Anita Bryant's Save the Children campaign from 1979? Okay. So, because this is, I think, when I think of like children and this idea that we're using somehow safeguarding the innocence of children as a reason that we are engaging in fill in the blank. I just am drawn back to Anita Bryant and Save the Children, and also Anita Bryant, very proud Oklahoman. She was actually Miss Oklahoma. Did you all know that? She lived in Florida because she sold orange juice, but she was a Miss Oklahoma, and my family's like favorite Italian restaurant in Oklahoma City had a framed huge picture of Anita Bryant, like that you had to like sit under. So I've seen things, but I think that it's an old story, and I think that's why I get so frustrated with Ron DeSantis using the terms groomer and this idea that children are still being propped up to sign quote unquote women's protection executive orders that are just anti-trans orders, right? And they do it because it works. And I think my thing is, how do you get it to stop working? And I don't know the answer to that. And then at the other end of that, so this whole thing is we're saving the children from groomers, or we're saving the children from having to read a young adult fiction with a trans character, right? I mean, this is where we are. And they spend so much time worried about it. But then I think to your question, what about the 9-year-old trans girl in Arizona, right? When are we protecting, who are we protecting, right? And Anita Bryant's not worried about all kids, right? And so I think pulling that out and naming it, that there is power to that. And I think that as a community, that it breaks my heart that every time I see a 9, a 10, 11, a 12-year-old testifying. Have you seen this? And they should be worried about other things. And it just breaks my heart. And I understand why they're doing it, and they have their own agency, and that's great. But I also think that there's a responsibility, sorry, I have allergies. I think there's also a responsibility of us older people to protect them and to help out in that. And I think I don't know, I think of my own silly 10-year-old and the idea of having him do that, it's heartbreaking. And I think we need to start, and I think it does go to sort of changing, not using children as pawns, whether because we want to protect them or because we want to be protected from them. At the end of the day, they are children. And what do we do with that? And I don't know. So no, I don't have an answer. I'm sorry. But thank you for entertaining my Anita Bryant thing, because I think that it's so true. And it's so like everything old is new again. And it's so, I'm over it.
I think that just like with other topics, the child, there can be this, I think in terms of discourse and ideology, this temptation to be like, no, we're not corrupting or grooming your children kind of thing. Like the sort of counter, like the sort of, no, we're this. Like, no, we're not doing that. And recently, for my trans studies reading group that I host at ASU, or Arizona State University, we had a theme. The theme for that month was trans masculinities, right? And so we read this piece by Kasia Adair and Erin Azura, and it's something like the trans. It's sort of speaking to this like fear of like moral panic, right? That's sort of in the kind of Republican discourse about the trans child. But it's something like the transgender craze that's corrupting, or no, that's seducing our children. The transgender craze that's seducing our children. And so like one discursive reaction could be like, no, we're not. You know, like, that's not what we're doing. But they sort of take it in a different direction, you know? They're like, absolutely, we are encouraging trans youth to desire and explore sexuality with whoever they want to, right? Absolutely. Absolutely, this idea of transgender should be contagious, because we're trans folks are awesome, you know? Contagion, yes. So the article, I mean, it's so brilliant in that way of doing that kind of shift. But I think, speaking back to this reading group that I host at ASU, you know, last year we had it, but it was for graduate students and faculty. This time it's including undergrads, and we just had our first one, and it's such a different but beautiful space where, like, you know, we sort of were like, yeah, we want to like talk about shifts in the field of trans studies, you know, and that's a conversation that's up here. But we kind of realized, you know, undergrads, 17, 18, 19-year-olds are brilliant. We teach a lot of them. And also, it's not just a knowledge space. Like, this space is a community space, and one that we need right now at all kind of ages and levels in the university, right? Which is also still not meant for us. Wasn't made for us, still just all these kind of barriers to being there and feeling at home in ourselves and our bodies. And I think a lot of, I think we talked about the production of knowledge, but I also see that a lot of trans and queer youth are making knowledge on TikTok and Instagram. And when we assign things like, hey, you know, write a paper about this, some of the sources and thinkers that they're citing are influencers, you know, folks kind of in this digital space that are creating knowledge, which is incredible, you know. So also kind of being attuned to like what folks that are younger or students are valuing. But yeah, I think that's all I have to say on that.
Thank you. Yeah, Anita Bryant. Some of this stuff reminds me too of the Satanic Panic, which was, you know, a made-up, fear-mongering, nationwide epidemic of satanic people that was linked. I'm thinking about something that ContraPoints talks about, and I don't know if you know ContraPoints, but she's my favorite. And I listen to her when I'm painting and things, and she is the one that really introduced me in a way to Anita Bryant. And shameful, I know. I grew up in the 90s, I'm sorry. We didn't talk about queerness a lot. But, you know, there are, to me, I think about this idea, like with protect the children, protect the innocent, as being about power. And, you know, I think about, like, one of the things I've been thinking a lot about, and I'm not, you know, I honestly, like, I'm on sabbatical, and the other day I was reading, and I was like, I have time to do this. I don't get to read a lot. But I was reading, and I was thinking, I'm reading this text called Witchcraft and Gay Counterculture, and it was published in 1964, and then republished in 1976, and then in like 2008, a queer collective ripped it and put it online as a PDF. And you can get it on Amazon, by the way. But I also just went to a store in Olympia, and they printed and bounded it for me too, because it's a PDF online, and they do that, and I think that's really, really rad. And I've been reading about this idea of how Christianity and, like Roman culture and Christianity, like it just meshed so well because they were both, like the Romans were like, this is something that we can really use like militaristically. And one of the things that they sort of were thinking about was this idea of like the pagans on the outside of the city and the Christians on the inside of the city. Right? And now I think it's kind of reversed. And I was thinking about this. And one of the things that being in rural America can provide you is a type of freedom that those of us in cities don't really know. And it's like an unsurveyed freedom. So you have places in rural areas in the early 2000s that were providing illegal DIY gender affirming surgery. And, there's this sort of like protection of being in the middle of nowhere that nobody will, like, it's a sort of protection. And when you were talking yesterday about private property, I was thinking a lot about this idea, like, like as a trans person, when I get on an airplane and I fly somewhere, what's the first thing that I do when I'm flying to another state? I read the laws. Can I pee? Is my ID going to be valid? And, am I going to be safe? Right? And most of the places that the answer is no in are rural places. And so, it's interesting to me when I was thinking about in this text, the way that they were talking about how, the first Christians were the military in Rome. They were the ones that really took hold of this idea of Christianity, were the legionnaires. And then that spread up to the officers, and then that spread up to like the people in charge. And then, the pagans were on the outside. And now I think it's like kind of the opposite, which is really interesting. And part of my thinking, like one of the things I find so frustrating is why are some of the most beautiful places in America off limits to people like me? And, as a child, I would go to the Smoky Mountains. And then, like as a young adult, I would not have a problem going and camping in the Smoky Mountains by myself. There is no chance that I'm going to go to the Smoky Mountains right now. But there are trans people that are doing that, right? And not just surviving, but also having fun. And in a way, that's that protection of rurality. Is that a word? Y'all are smarter than I. Rurality. Is that a word? Thank you. I think you have to say it very British, like the issues of royalty is, yeah. I am British, so I can make fun of British accents. But the children, right, must be protected because the power of cis-het Christian reproduction and is what manifests into the power of that group of people. And that is the power that, they cannot relinquish. And I believe that really, I'm a teacher. I mean, when I taught public school, even though I wasn't even out as trans, I was up for a full-time job, and one of the people who was on the hiring panel wouldn't hire me because I had an earring. I eventually got a job at that school. It was my old high school. And, I had parents be like, I'm taking you in front of the school board because you told my students that the dark ages weren't really that dark. And all this stuff was happening, like this sort of like co-opting of like education as a way to sort of like make sure the child doesn't know about something which is dangerous to their power as cis-het Christian families. And I see that with AIDS. Now I ask my students what they know about AIDS, my college students, and they don't know anything. And I say, who's on PrEP? like one student's like, I'm on prep. And they're usually a gay student, a gay male student. But like, that hurts everybody so much, right? Like that hurts everybody who has intercourse. But yet we're like, we won't talk about it because it goes against cis, white, heteronormative Christian culture. And that's what the children are, right? They're pawns in that game. And that's why they don't want them to go to college. And that's why now they're trying to control the colleges. And education is a battlefield for the ability to disperse intellectual, materials and concepts of freedom. Do you all think liberals have done a really bad job of creating a very hostile environment to points of view outside of our own belief structures? Like, I think, when I ran the gallery at my college, like I had to figure this out. Do I show a really good pro-Trump painter? If I don't, do I believe in free speech? Right? I wouldn't. But like, there's a question, right? Like, we demand absolute freedom of our ability to demand our rights. And then yet there's kind of like this other side of that conversation. I think you were talking about that in a little bit of a way, which is like meeting people where they are and then trying to convince them. And I think sometimes as a teacher, like, I'm like, oh wait, did I shut down the opportunity for that? But that's also how they win, which is like getting you into this like loop of like, you shouldn't be as vocal and angry as you are, because it goes against someone else's beliefs that you should not have rights. So I think it's like a really good question, which is like, as liberals, have we done a bad job of creating spaces for dialogue? Please don't come after me for this question.
I'm going to give not a liberal perspective. So as a person who's not a liberal, also not a conservative, there's a lot more out here, right?
I'm just learning that there is a big difference. Like I feel like I'm so out of touch with the world. I'm like, wait, I'm not a liberal now? Wait, shit. Like, what am I now?
Well, but I think the stakes of the question are also important, right? And personally, right, the way that I approach pedagogy is that the classroom is a space of free expression, but it's a place of free expression within the bounds of a particular ethics, right? So the claim from the right is often like, we don't have a space that we are able to talk freely in. But what they're really asking for is a space that they can freely demonize other people, right? And so if my perspective is that everybody has the right to the dignity and humanity and all those kind of democratic ideals that, for the most part, are good, right? The people who are going to suffer from this like open-ended, open terrain, anything goes type of environment are going to be the most marginalized people. They're going to be those groups of people. So that's, again, personally my perspective. But I do think that the university as a whole has done not this university in particular, but universities, the academy as a whole, right, has done a very poor job of getting that across and ceding a lot of territory to the right, especially around questions of transness, especially around questions of indigeneity, and especially around questions of anti-blackness, anti-migrant sentiment, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera.
If you guys want to take questions from the audience, I can take a mic.
I'm sorry for throwing that like huge major like quandary at you. I mean, like, I'm in agreement. I just wonder how long the mission statements are going to hold up. Honestly, right?
Well, but I think that it raises the question of what are you silencing and what are you not giving space to? If somebody is, I'm trying to think of something boring. I don't know if any know, like a CPA thing. I don't know. I always pick on CPAs, but like, if you're discriminating against somebody because they voted for Trump and what they're wanting to present on is about concrete, I don't know, I'm trying to think of something boring, then that is incorrect and that is wrong, right? If you are not letting somebody talk about how queer and trans people are groomers and are brainwashing children into going to the bathroom in litter boxes, that's not discrimination. That is actually just, I think, creating a respectful and ethical space. And I think that it is this, you have to push back on perhaps the demand that, no, I don't have, free speech does not actually demand that I give space to harmful, false propaganda, right? Free speech does require a lot of things, right? And especially in America, we have a really, really expansive free speech that most other nations don't have, right? We allow Westboro Baptist Church to picket at military funerals, right? Yes, we allow that. We don't have to, however, give equal space to complete falsehoods in the classroom.
I agree.
Because there are some things that are real and some things that are not, and I think that's the problem, is that there is actually a truth, there is actually a reality, and just because you say it out loud doesn't make it so. I think.
Yeah, I agree.
If there are questions from the audience, we have a little bit of time.
Hello. I'm a senior in high school right now, and I'm in like an AP class where we have a year-long research project going on that we then have to like write an academic paper about. So I'm doing mine kind of on creating a trans history curriculum for high school students, because I think that's a really important way to like kind of stop and prevent hate. And yeah, it's how I like to be kind of an activist, you know? And it's probably gonna be about 1 unit because that's all the word space I have for in the paper. And yeah, so my question is, what is like one event, perspective, or idea that you would include in a transgender history curriculum if the goal is to educate people in a way that will prevent hate?
I think for me, the Compton cafeteria riots, 1966, San Francisco, Tenderloin, I believe, and just like trans women taking up space, or street queens, right, taking up space in that cafe. Basically, like some similar things have happened around the country, like sort of like around like donut shops as well. And just, you know, contesting being kicked out of a space that's like providing them community, a place to rest and sit. Susan Stryker does a phenomenal documentary called Screaming Queens about that riot. And so, yeah, that would be like a cool, like to like pair, I think, some of her historical writing in, what's that one called? Yeah, Transgender History, with the documentary on that. And I think that there are probably placards around San Francisco. So if you were, of course, are like, I think a lot of you all actually travel with your students here at PNCA, but, you know, being able to go to San Francisco, Tenderloin. They have a transgender district now that I think is near the sort of where Compton Cafeteria was. And so I think, you know, being able to create a curriculum that sort of is bringing those different types of media together about the event. I think that riot is so important because folks will think that Stonewall was the first riot, but there was also, I think, like the Dewey lunch counter in Philly, as there was like a sort of contestation there, right? So yeah, that's I think why bringing that history forward is nice, to sort of have folks not think about Stonewall as this moment of exception around folks organizing around gender justice and being able to have self-determination about their gender expression and their bodies. Yeah, so that's one thing I'd add.
I mean, Susan Stryker is a wonderful historian and academic that you should definitely be looking at. Yeah, definitely. A very rich text that has a lot of really great historical information that you could probably gather from is A Brief History of Transmisogyny by Jules Giles Peterson. It's a fantastic text. I will not, as a dyslexic ADHD babe, it's a little hard for me to get through. So she also has a really great lecture on YouTube that gives a lot of the same information. And I kind of go back and forth from both of those to try to gather, as much information. Yeah, the Compton cafeteria riot for sure. And, I think also, there are some older texts. You probably may know if they've been updated or changed, but like Transgender Warrior, which is a good text. That's where I first learned about like the Chevalier de Eon, which I just totally butchered. I should just do it in English. Yeah, just Chevalier, yeah, de Eon, yeah, is right. I cannot say that word, Chevalier. This is why the French don't like the British. What is it? Yes! Beautiful. Chevalier d'Eon. There you go. My trans ancestor is screaming at me. Yeah, personally, I'm also going to, and I know this is very Eurocentric, and I apologize for that, but I'm also going to push you towards Joan of Arc, who I'm covered in. And understand when you read that Joan of Arc was tried as a witch and tried for heresy, that heresy is a code word for queerness and transness.
And she's in Transgender Warriors, right?
Yeah.
Yeah.
So, yeah.
Leslie Feinberg.
Yeah. Yeah, Leslie Feinberg.
Do it.
Yeah, totally. I like the fact, I'm just gonna go back to what we talked about with education. Like the fact that you're actually being able to do this is astounding to me. It is astounding that you are at a school where this can fly. It is like this is astounding. And, I always tell people, like, when I was 5, I started praying to witches, and now I pay doctors who are just witches, really, right? Just like a different form. Like, I never even believed, it's like the thing where you sit in a room of trans women and you're all looking at the floor and yet because you don't want to acknowledge each other, because you don't want to out anybody. And you're like looking at the floor and then you're thinking to yourself, like, I never thought I'd meet another person like me, right? And there's like this acknowledgement of you're like, oh, you're trans, okay, I'm just gonna look at the floor and I know we're all here to see a trans doctor, but we're not gonna It's astounding. It's a sign that like things can change and shift, because the reason that we're so vilified right now is because we're so visible. And I look to my ancestors and my living elders, who I watched on Jerry Springer on episodes like, can you tell she's a he? And like those are the people I grew up with that I connect with. I watched them on Maury Povich. I watched them on Jerry Springer and Ricky Lake, and they were there as proclamations of ridicule almost. Although Jerry Springer always did his 1 minute of gentle talk after each episode. but they were like, I was like, oh my gosh, these people look like how I feel. And so what you're doing is really important, but also recognize that the fact that you're doing it is really important. And like, that's, you know, to understand that history, you don't even have to go that far back. You know, you can look at Susan Stryker, you can look at Leslie Feinberg, you can look at other trans women that were like, just 30 years ago, like paving the way for you to be, like, you don't have to look back to Joan of Arc, you know. Oh yeah, Sylvia Rivera. Yeah, and I want to say something. We also talked earlier about like children going to legislation and begging for their rights, right? Like the young man that fought all the way up to the Supreme Court for his right to use the bathroom. I'm so sorry, I can't remember his name. Thank you, Gavin. Is now unhoused and suffers like mental health issues. And he spent all of his young adulthood fighting for his rights. Like he should be taking care, like we as a community should be like paying his rent, right? But even worse, he's watching Virginia undo everything that he fought for. And, you know, I think that one of the big things that I see is the use of white trans children that look very appealing to the constructs and ideas of non-dangerous body being brought in front of these legislation, you know, boards or whatever they are, committees. And I think we're going to fail that. You know, I feel like it's a political choice and it's going to fail. Like, transness is not a white middle class problem. And so, yeah, we need to see the children, the trans children of color. We need to, and yeah, there's also like that layer of like, we don't want additionally marginalized people to have to fight, you know, and be visible. But also like, it's just another way of co-opting the movement and saying this is a white middle class movement. Going back to what you're saying about children. Yeah, I don't know. So that's something, I mean, like for me, you know, Susan Stryker, just devour it. Just devour it. Yeah.
So we're out of time, unfortunately. But I'm happy to chat with anybody after if they have particular questions. And thank you to so much, if we can get a round of applause for the panelists. And also for everyone who put this on, all the folks who did the work of like prepping for this, doing that labor, please, thank you so much. And thank you everybody for attending.